The courtroom clock ticked louder than usual that morning. It was 8:46 a.m. in Riverside County, Georgia, and Marcus Hale gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than normal. He wasn't the kind of man who ever ran late. For a federal prosecutor, time wasn't just discipline, but it was duty. But today, time had turned against him. Traffic. A last-minute call from his team about a sensitive racketeering case. A dozen small delays that stacked together until he found himself sprinting through the courthouse parking lot, his heart pounding harder than his footsteps. The morning sun glared across the old brick building as he reached the steps. He paused for one deep breath. The Riverside Municipal Court wasn't the kind of place Marcus usually dealt with. He handled federal cases, big trials, organized crime, corruption, not property tax appeals over an inherited house. But this wasn't just any house. It was the home his grandmother built with her own hands. The city had raised the taxes overnight, and Marcus was determined to fight it. Inside, the courthouse looked worn and tired, a place that had seen more struggle than justice. Paint peeled from beige walls. The air carried that stale scent of old paper and burnt coffee. People sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching documents, whispering names and numbers as if their whole lives depended on the next few minutes. Marcus checked his watch. 8 minutes to spare. He walked quickly down a narrow hall until he found the sign, Room 3B, Judge Robert Harlan. That name had already come up once that morning. His assistant had texted him just before he left the office. Be careful. Judge Harlan is strict, especially about lateness. Marcus pushed through the heavy door. Every eye seemed to flick toward him as he entered. He found a seat in the back row and opened his folder. Documents perfectly aligned, evidence highlighted, arguments rehearsed. He was ready. At the front of the room, a tall, lean man with silver hair adjusted his robe and settled behind the bench. Judge Harlan's expression was carved in stone. His pale blue eyes swept the courtroom with cold precision. He didn't speak loudly, but his authority filled every inch of the room. The bailiff's command broke the silence. All rise. As people stood, Marcus noticed something unsettling. A middle-aged man wandered in late, still adjusting his tie. The judge didn't even look up. Moments later, a young woman entered quietly with her phone in hand. Again, no reaction. Then the judge's gaze found Marcus. Marcus Hale, the clerk called out. Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, and stepped forward. His shoes echoed across the old tile floor, a sound sharper than he expected. He placed his folder on the podium, his movements steady. Before he could even speak, Judge Harlan leaned forward, his voice slicing through the air. You're late, Mr. Hale. Marcus blinked. Your Honor, The judge cut him off. Do you think your time is more important than the court's? A quiet wave of tension rolled through the room. Marcus could feel the stares of everyone behind him. He spoke carefully. Your Honor, I apologize. I was dealing with an urgent matter from my office. A federal case involving human trafficking. I came here as quickly as I could. Judge Harlan's expression didn't soften. This courtroom runs on order. Excuses do not excuse disrespect. His hand lifted slightly, then dropped like a hammer. $750 fine for contempt. The words hit harder than the gavel that followed. The sound echoed off the walls like thunder. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He felt the disbelief ripple through the crowd, the whispered shock, the uneasy shifting of feet. He noticed the man who'd come in late still sitting comfortably in the front row, untouched. The young woman beside him smiled faintly, scrolling through her phone. Marcus met the judge's eyes and gave a polite nod. Understood, Your Honor. He turned and walked back to his seat, his composure unwavering even as frustration simmered beneath it. He opened his folder again, pretending to review notes, but his mind wasn't on the property taxes anymore. This wasn't about being late. It was about being seen. He began jotting something down. Not legal arguments this time, but observations. Names, times, who was late. Who was ignored. Who was punished. Years of courtroom instinct told him something was off, and he trusted that instinct more than anything. As the judge moved through more cases, Marcus sat in silence, the hum of injustice loud in his ears. He had faced hardened criminals, corrupt officials, and courtroom battles that dragged on for months. But this moment felt different. More personal. When his name was called again, he stood and approached the bench, calm but resolved. He laid out the documents showing clear evidence that the city had overcharged his grandmother's property by nearly 30%. "This is the original assessment," he said, pointing to the first page. "It stayed consistent for years. The new rate doesn't match the city's valuation or the surrounding averages." Judge Harlan leaned back with an air of impatience. "I'll review it when I have time. For now, we're still addressing your tardiness." Marcus kept his tone steady. "With respect, Your Honor, the federal case that delayed me was a matter of immediate public safety." The judge's lips curled into a thin smile. "Your job does not place you above the rules. This court does not bend for anyone." Something in those words struck Marcus deeply, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. The tone wasn't about rules. It was about power. Marcus took a slow breath. "Your Honor, I understand rules. I live by them. But fairness should apply to everyone in this room equally. I noticed others who arrived after me were not fined." A hush fell over the room. The judge's color shifted. His grip tightened on the gavel. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Hale?" Marcus held the judge's stare. "I'm asking if fairness is still part of its foundation." The gavel slammed down again. "Your fine stands. Watch your tone." Marcus nodded slowly. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he returned to his seat, he felt the tension in the air, the quiet admiration from some, the fear from others. An older man a few rows ahead glanced back at him, giving a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Marcus looked down at his notes. The ink lines on the page formed something bigger than a tax dispute. A record, a starting point, a spark. He didn't know it yet, but that spark would soon light a fire that reached far beyond Riverside. Marcus waited until the last case was called. The room had thinned out, leaving only a few stragglers shuffling papers and whispering at the back. The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly tired, his robe hanging loosely from his shoulders. Marcus gathered his things slowly. He was calm now, too calm, the kind of stillness that only came when his mind was sharper than his emotions. The fine didn't bother him as much as what it revealed. The judge's actions had stripped away the illusion of fairness, and Marcus wasn't going to let it pass. He walked toward the podium again, his footsteps echoing in the near-empty courtroom. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The clerk froze mid-keystroke. Judge Harlan looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "The court session has ended, Mr. Hale. You may leave," the judge said, his tone dismissive. "With respect, Your Honor," Marcus replied evenly. "I think it's important that I introduce myself properly." The judge frowned. "Introduce yourself?" Marcus reached into his briefcase and took out his identification wallet. He opened it slowly and placed it on the podium, angled toward the bench so the seal caught the light. "My name is Marcus Hale. I'm an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of Georgia. I've been with the Department of Justice for 12 years, working on cases involving civil rights violations, corruption, and organized crime." The room fell utterly silent. Judge Harlan's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. His hands froze on the papers in front of him. Marcus continued, his voice calm but firm. "I was late today because of an urgent federal matter. But that isn't the issue. The issue is how this courtroom handles its citizens. I've observed clear differences in treatment toward those who entered late this morning, myself included." The judge's jaw tightened. "Mr. Hale, if you have a complaint, file it through proper channels. This is not the time or place for accusations." Marcus nodded slightly. "I've already begun documenting the events of this morning. What I witnessed raises questions about fairness and equal treatment, questions that should never exist in a courtroom." The clerk's fingers hovered above the keyboard. Her eyes darted between them, unsure whether to keep typing. The bailiff looked uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "Are you accusing this court of bias?" the judge asked, his voice now quieter but sharper. Marcus met his gaze without blinking. "I'm stating that patterns like this deserve scrutiny. I'm not just an attorney, Your Honor. I'm also a citizen who believes that justice should look the same for everyone who walks through that door." The judge leaned back, visibly unsettled. His authority, the same authority that moments ago felt absolute, now seemed fragile. "This conversation is over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus closed his ID case and placed it back in his briefcase. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll make sure this is addressed through the appropriate channels." As he turned to leave, a quiet murmur rose from the few people still seated in the gallery. An older man whispered something to the woman beside him. The young law student in the back row scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes wide with disbelief. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. Marcus paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could still feel the energy of the room, the discomfort, the silence, the fear of confrontation. It wasn't the first time he'd seen that fear, but this time it had a face. He took out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he reached the number for his assistant back at the U.S. Attorney's office. He hesitated. Then he shook his head. "Not yet," he muttered under his breath. He sat on the steps for a while, flipping through his notes. Every line he'd written earlier now looked like evidence of something larger. He had no proof yet, but his instincts told him this wasn't an isolated incident. When he finally got back to his car, the decision was made. He placed his briefcase on the passenger seat, opened it, and pulled out his badge again. The gold emblem glimmered in the sunlight. It wasn't just authority, it was responsibility. That evening, Marcus sat in his office surrounded by files and documents. He went through public court records for Judge Harlan's cases, cross-referencing fines, penalties, and dismissal rates. Within hours, patterns began to appear. Fines against black defendants were consistently higher. Sentencing remarks were harsher. Requests for leniency were denied more often than not. By midnight, Marcus had compiled a 20-page summary. It wasn't enough for a case, but it was enough to start one. The next morning, his supervisor, Julia Merritt, called him before he'd even finished his coffee. "I read your report," she said without preamble. Her voice carried that sharp calm of someone who'd seen too much and still believed in change. "Marcus, if this data is accurate, it's not just about one judge. This could be systemic." "I believe it is," Marcus said. "And if we dig deeper, we'll find more." Julia sighed. "Then let's dig, but do it quietly. We don't want this to turn into a media circus before we have the evidence." "I understand," he replied. After the call, Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the growing stack of papers. He wasn't just revisiting a courtroom slight anymore. He was staring into the heart of something rotten, something that had gone unchecked for far too long, and this time he wasn't going to walk away. Within a week, word began to spread through quiet whispers and cautious phone calls. Attorneys who had practiced in Judge Harlan's courtroom started reaching out to Marcus one by one. They spoke in careful tones at first, always checking if the line was secure, if anyone else might be listening. A defense lawyer named Angela Boyd was the first to break the silence. She'd been in practice for over 20 years. "I've seen it for years, Marcus," she said. "Same charges, different faces, different outcomes. Black defendants fined 3, sometimes 4 times higher. I filed motions, but they never went anywhere. Everyone just learned to work around him." Marcus took notes as she spoke. "Work around him," she repeated. The word stuck in his mind like an accusation. After Angela came a young public defender barely out of law school. She described watching a teenager fined nearly $1,000 for a noise violation, while a white college student walked away with a warning for the same offense. She'd left the courtroom that day in tears, convinced she'd failed her client. Each call added to the growing weight of evidence. By the end of the second week, Marcus's small office looked more like a war room. Court transcripts covered his desk. Charts and handwritten notes lined the wall. Every page told the same story, a pattern of bias hiding behind formality and procedure. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The court clerk, Mrs. Patterson, reached out one evening. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "I don't know if I should be doing this," she said, "but I can't keep quiet anymore." She admitted she'd been keeping a private notebook for years. Dates, names, remarks, fines. Every time something didn't feel right, she wrote it down. When she handed it over to investigators from the Judicial Review Commission, Marcus could almost feel the air shift. This was no longer suspicion. It was evidence. Inside the notebook were pages filled with small, neat handwriting. March 12th, black defendant fined $500 for parking violation. White defendant, same charge, warning. June 8th, judge interrupted defendant repeatedly. Tone aggressive. September 5th, defendant's explanation dismissed without review. Mrs. Patterson's notes went back nearly 10 years. When Marcus showed the findings to Julia, She exhaled slowly. "This isn't bias," she said. "It's systemic misconduct. And we're not just talking about Harlan anymore. If he's been allowed to operate like this for a decade, others might be doing the same." The next day, the commission opened a formal investigation. Word leaked within 48 hours. Reporters started calling. Headlines hit the local news before anyone could contain it. Federal prosecutor probes Riverside judge for racial bias. Justice or prejudice? Inside the courtroom under fire, Marcus ignored the noise and kept working. He knew media attention could cloud the process, but he also knew the truth had a way of finding its own voice. Meanwhile, the courthouse buzzed with unease. Mrs. Patterson faced quiet stares from co-workers who didn't know whether to thank her or avoid her. The bailiff, James Nolan, a man who had served under Judge Harlan for 15 years, finally came forward. He spoke softly, but his words carried the weight of honesty. "I've watched people walk in afraid and walk out broken," he said during his interview. It wasn't always what the judge said, it was how he said it. You could see who mattered to him and who didn't. By the end of the month, more than 30 witnesses had given statements. The evidence was overwhelming. Patterns emerged so clearly that even the most skeptical reviewers couldn't deny them. As the inquiry deepened, a young law student named Rachel Kim, who had been in the courtroom the day Marcus confronted the judge, wrote about the experience on her blog. She described the silence, the tension, the way Marcus had stood calmly while the judge's authority cracked. Her post went viral overnight. Thousands shared it. Within days, national outlets picked up the story. Marcus's phone didn't stop ringing. Every call, every message, every headline added fuel to something much larger than he had intended. Julia called again, this time with a tone that mixed pride and warning. "The story's out of our hands now. You did what was right, Marcus, but the public pressure is mounting. The commission's under fire, the media's circling, and Harlan's office is panicking. Be ready for backlash." "I expected it," Marcus said. "I just didn't expect it this fast." She paused. "Then stay steady. The truth needs a calm voice." Marcus spent that evening reading through letters and emails from strangers. Some offered thanks. Others shared their own stories of bias in courtrooms across the country. One message came from a retired judge who simply wrote, "It takes one person's courage to start the fall of a wall. Don't stop now." By the start of the third week, protests had formed outside the Riverside courthouse. Signs filled the air. "Justice should be blind. End bias now. Equal law for all." From his office window, Marcus watched the crowd swell, a mix of anger, hope, and exhaustion. He didn't crave attention, but he understood what it meant. People weren't just protesting one judge anymore. They were standing against a system that had quietly looked away for too long. That same day, the Judicial Review Commission summoned Judge Harlan for questioning. Behind closed doors, he denied everything. He claimed coincidence, context, misinterpretation. But the numbers told a story statistics couldn't hide. Marcus wasn't in the room when the judge spoke, but he didn't need to be. He'd seen it all before. The defensiveness, the pride, the refusal to see beyond one's own authority. And yet, deep down, he knew something was changing. The silence that once protected injustice was cracking open. That night, as rain tapped against his office window, Marcus sat back in his chair. He glanced at the framed fine from that morning, a copy he'd requested from the court records office. He'd had it printed and placed on his wall right above his desk, not as a trophy, as a reminder of how one small act of defiance could awaken an entire system. The storm outside grew heavier, thunder rolling low in the distance. Marcus turned off the light and whispered to himself, "This isn't the end. It's just the start." And somewhere across town, in a house full of old papers and memories, Judge Robert Harlan sat alone at his dining table, staring at a notebook the investigators hadn't yet seen, one he was too afraid to destroy, too ashamed to open. The next morning, everything would begin to unravel. The morning broke heavy with tension. Outside the courthouse, camera crews lined the sidewalks. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, microphones ready, eyes fixed on the doors. Inside, the air felt different, thicker, charged. People whispered as they passed each other in the corridors. Judge Robert Harlan walked through the entrance just after 9, his head held high, but his face pale. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one holding power. His steps were measured, deliberate, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked nervously from face to face, searching for sympathy he wouldn't find. The Judicial Review Commission had begun its public hearings. What was once a quiet investigation had become a national story. The commission room was packed. Attorneys, community leaders, journalists, and ordinary citizens who'd been following every update. The air buzzed with the sound of papers rustling and camera shutters clicking. Marcus sat near the front, his expression calm, his notes spread neatly before him. Across the room, Judge Harlan avoided his gaze. The first witness called was Mrs. Patterson. She clutched her small notebook like a shield. Her voice shook at first, but strength grew with every sentence. She described the years of inconsistency she had witnessed, the days she left the courthouse with guilt sitting heavy on her chest. "I wanted to speak up sooner," she said, her voice cracking. "But I was afraid." We all were. The room went silent. For a moment, even the clicking cameras stopped. Next came James Nolan, the veteran bailiff. His testimony was steady, his words simple but cutting. "I've seen people walk in scared, and I've watched them leave broken. I can't keep pretending I didn't notice." Then came the flood of defendants. Dozens stepped forward, each story more painful than the last. A young mother fined hundreds of dollars for contesting a broken parking meter. A retired teacher humiliated in front of the court for being disorganized. A small business owner who'd lost his permit over a clerical error. While others were granted leniency, the more they spoke, the clearer the pattern became. The disparity was undeniable. By the end of the second day, the commission released preliminary data. Over a 5-year period, black defendants in Harlan's courtroom had been fined an average of 3 times more than white defendants for identical offenses. Requests for leniency had been approved for white defendants 70% of the time, but for black defendants, only 12. When the numbers were read aloud, a murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Judge Harlan shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. "Statistics don't show context," he muttered. "Every case is unique." Marcus turned toward him then, his voice quiet but firm. "Context doesn't erase a pattern, Judge." The former judge's eyes flicked toward him, anger flashing briefly before giving way to something closer to fear. Outside, protests grew louder. The courthouse steps became a sea of signs, voices rising in unity. Justice for all. No more hidden bias. Equal courts. Equal rights. Inside, the hearings continued for days. Every witness, every record, every piece of evidence tightened the circle around Harlan's legacy. The turning point came when one of Harlan's former clerks, a young man named David Lang, testified. He had been fresh out of law school when he worked for the judge, full of idealism and ambition, but his time in that courtroom had changed him. "I remember asking why certain defendants were treated more harshly," David said quietly. He told me, "Some people need a harder lesson." I didn't understand what he meant at first. Then I started to see who he meant. The words landed like a hammer blow. Gasps rippled through the room. Harlan's attorney objected, claiming hearsay, but the damage was done. The truth wasn't confined to records anymore. It had a voice, and the whole country was listening. By the end of the week, the evidence was overwhelming. The commission called for immediate disciplinary action and referred the case to the state's judicial board for review. Harlan faced possible removal, criminal investigation, and public disgrace. The news hit every major outlet. National headlines ran for days. Commentators debated judicial accountability, systemic bias, and the failure of oversight. Civil rights organizations rallied. Law students across the country held forums discussing the case. Through it all, Marcus kept working quietly behind the scenes. He refused interviews, turned down television appearances, and focused instead on the data. For him, it was never about fame, it was about proof. About justice that couldn't be denied or forgotten once the cameras moved on. Late one night, Julia visited his office. Her expression was tired but proud. "They're recommending his suspension," she said. "It's not final yet, but it's happening." Marcus leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "It's a start." "You've done more than start," she said. "You've shifted something real. People are watching now. They're questioning things that used to go unnoticed." He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "Change doesn't end with one man losing his robe. It ends when the system itself changes." Julia smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure it does." The following week, Judge Robert Harlan announced his resignation. He released a short statement to the press. citing personal reasons and a desire not to distract from the integrity of the court. But everyone knew the truth. For the first time in decades, a sitting judge had been forced to step down under the weight of undeniable bias. The announcement sent a shockwave through the state. Some celebrated, others called it overdue, and many quietly began to look inward, wondering how many more courtrooms held the same hidden imbalance. Marcus watched the coverage from his office. His phone buzzed constantly, colleagues, reporters, friends, all wanting his reaction. He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the framed fine on his wall. That single slip of paper had started everything. A $750 fine had exposed a system built on silence. He leaned forward, folded his hands, and whispered to himself, "Now comes the hard part." The next day, he walked back into the same courthouse, not as a complainant, but as a speaker. The Judicial Review Commission had invited him to address the judges, clerks, and attorneys gathered for a mandatory reform conference. As he stepped into the renovated courtroom, he noticed the changes already taking shape. The walls had been repainted, the benches repaired, the atmosphere lighter somehow, but the weight of history still lingered, quiet but undeniable. He stood at the front, took a breath, and began to speak. "We don't build justice with words. We build it with courage, with the willingness to face the moments that make us uncomfortable. Fairness isn't an idea, it's an action, and every person in this room has the power to make it real." The audience listened in silence. Some nodded. Some wiped tears. Others simply stared, knowing the truth of his words because they had seen it for themselves. As Marcus finished, a long applause filled the room. It wasn't loud or chaotic, it was steady, purposeful. A sound that carried both relief and responsibility. For the first time, it felt like something inside that courthouse had truly changed. But Marcus knew the road ahead was longer than anyone wanted to admit. He would spend the next year turning reform into reality. One policy, one training, one conversation at a time. And yet, even as progress grew, he could never forget that morning, the sting of the judge's words, the silence of the crowd, and the power of one quiet decision to stand up. Because justice, he realized, begins not with laws or titles, but with the simple courage to say, "This is wrong." Months passed, but the fire Marcus had ignited refused to die down. Across the state, courthouses that had once operated quietly began to stir with change. Committees formed, oversight boards expanded, and judges who had grown comfortable in unchecked authority now found themselves under new scrutiny. Marcus didn't chase the headlines. He worked behind them. He met with legal reformers, civil rights advocates, and community leaders who wanted to ensure the movement didn't fade once the spotlight dimmed. The reports from the Riverside hearings had become a model for reform. Every week, new data poured in from cities across Georgia, revealing patterns that mirrored Harlan's court. It was bigger than one man now. It was a mirror held up to an entire system. A few months later, Marcus stood before a class of law students at the university in Savannah. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, the students leaning forward as he spoke. "Justice isn't about winning," he told them. "It's about seeing the truth, even when others choose not to. Seeing the person behind the case file, seeing the difference between power and fairness." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Do you ever regret what you did? The exposure, the backlash?" Marcus paused for a moment, looking out at the eager faces before him. "No," he said softly, "because silence is the only thing that ever lets injustice grow. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You can only choose to act." After the lecture, students gathered around him, thanking him, asking questions, wanting to know how they could make a difference. It reminded him of Rachel Kim, the student whose blog post had helped spark the movement. She was now interning at the Department of Justice, inspired by that one morning in court. Back in Riverside, change had taken root in visible ways. The courthouse where it all began now displayed a bronze plaque near the entrance. It read, "Equal justice belongs to everyone." The simple words drew visitors every day. Clerks, lawyers, and citizens stopped to read it before walking inside, as if reminding themselves of what the building was meant to stand for. Mrs. Patterson had been promoted to oversee new clerk training, ensuring records were transparent and accessible. James Nolan, the veteran bailiff, had retired from security work and now led seminars on courtroom ethics and respect. Even Judge Harlan's former law clerk, David Lang, had found a path toward redemption. He started a non-profit program mentoring young attorneys of color, teaching them how to navigate the profession with strength and integrity. Marcus visited Riverside one afternoon almost a year after that morning. The sky was clear and the courthouse steps looked brighter than he remembered. Inside, the old beige walls had been repainted in warm tones, and new signs directed people to legal aid offices and community assistance desks. He walked through the halls quietly, unnoticed by most. A new judge presided over the bench now, one known for fairness and patience. The courtroom was full, yet the energy felt lighter, freer. As he stood near the back, he caught the faint echo of a gavel. But this time it didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like order, real order, the kind built on balance, not fear. A young man sitting beside him leaned over and whispered, "You're Marcus Hale, aren't you?" Marcus smiled slightly. "I am." "My father told me about what you did here," the young man said. "He said it changed everything." Marcus looked at him, then back toward the front of the courtroom. "Change is never everything," he said quietly. "It's the start of something new." Outside, the sun dipped low, spilling gold light across the courthouse steps. Marcus paused at the top and glanced back at the plaque near the door. The words glimmered faintly in the setting light. He thought of all the people whose courage had brought that moment to life. Mrs. Patterson's trembling voice, James Nolan's quiet confession, Julia's steady guidance, and the dozens of citizens who had risked their silence to speak the truth. It wasn't victory he felt standing there. It was something deeper, peace maybe, or gratitude. The kind that comes when the fight has changed you more than you ever expected. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Julia. State Board approves full judicial reform initiative. Bias audits mandatory statewide. It's done. Marcus stopped walking, staring at the screen. Then he smiled, small and real. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle. The fine from that morning, still framed in his office, had started all of this. A reminder of how a single act of defiance could ripple through walls built to last forever. Before driving away, he looked once more at the courthouse through his windshield. The building that had once represented silence now stood for something louder, something unbreakable. Justice. Later that year, Marcus was invited to Washington to speak at a national conference on judicial ethics. He stepped onto the stage before hundreds of lawyers, judges, and lawmakers. He looked across the crowd, then down at the speech he'd written, and folded the paper away. He spoke from memory, from the heart. "We can build systems that look fair," he said. "But real justice lives in the choices we make when no one's watching. It's in the courage to question what's comfortable, to speak when silence feels safer. We don't need perfection. We need integrity, and integrity begins with truth." The hall filled with applause that seemed to stretch endlessly, not for him, but for what his story had become. A reflection of what was possible when one person refused to bow to fear. That night, as Marcus walked through the quiet streets of the capital, he thought of his grandmother's house, the reason he'd stepped into that courthouse in the first place. The same house that had been nearly lost to an unjust tax. The memory of her voice came back to him, gentle but firm. "Stand up for what's right, Marcus, even when you stand alone." He smiled at the thought, the city lights flickering across his face. The fight had changed him, but it had also restored something deep within him, a belief that justice wasn't a dream. It was a choice, and every choice mattered. He looked up at the dark sky above the city, where clouds moved quietly across the stars. Somewhere out there, another courtroom waited, another voice ready to rise. And Marcus Hale knew that this story, the one born from one unfair fine, was only the beginning of many more to come.